Phil Bellfy, and I'm a retired professor from Michigan State University, and I've lived up north in the Sioux since 1970. But my native roots go back at least 10 generations to Sault Ste. Marie in this general area here. So this is my home, even though I grew up in the Detroit area. I decided to run, number one, because I have the experience and the education and the drive and motivation to actually do something for the people up here. And mainly my concern is environmental. I noticed, I'm sure you all noticed, the Enbridge pipeline was a very big issue. Of course, the Enbridge people had that great Kalamazoo. So it put, unfortunately, in many respects, it put northern Michigan on the map as the next possible site for a huge oil spill. So that's when I decided to run, and I was informed about that issue. And I've been working on environmental issues for over 40 years, mostly in the Sioux, but with tribal people too, throughout the whole area, including Canada. So I have the experience, I have the knowledge, I have the managerial experience, if you will, and a whole bunch of different things I could tell you about. But I think that the current state rep who wants to be our state senator has just been wrong on all the issues that people are concerned about up here. So that's my intent, to show people that there is an alternative, and I hope to be successful in November, of course.
As you're campaigning, what's the main issue you're hearing from voters that affects them the most or that they want to see tackled?
Well, like I said, the environment is a very, very huge issue. And I can't remember exactly when it was, but several months ago there was a public forum in Mackinac City put on by the Mackinac County Planning Commission, I believe. They invited Enbridge to this meeting to present their side of the issue. And they literally had to turn people away from the door. They had so many people at that forum that everybody who wanted to be there couldn't be there. So I realized at that point that this is a very, very big issue. I've lived up north for many, many years, and I never saw that many people in one place in my life, because this is an issue that affects people very, very closely. So that was the driving force that made me decide that I'm going to run under this environmental banner.
Let's talk about roads here first, one of the most pressing issues. What's your plan to, I mean, all studies, all experts have said the state needs about $1.5 billion in additional annual funding to fix Michigan's roads. What's your plan to create that money?
Well, I drove down, of course, from Sault Ste. Marie, and there's a lot of pretty bad roads all over the place. And I did hear on the radio, I think it was yesterday, that the legislature is finally going to decide to do something about it, maybe. And Wayne Schmidt is the chair of the Transportation Committee, and they haven't been able to come up with a plan yet. And my biggest fear, quite frankly, is that we as common ordinary taxpayers are going to be stuck with another huge bill for this. The legislature found enough money to give a $1.8 billion tax break to their wealthy friends. They also found another $590 million in what they call the personal property tax allotment. And my argument was, during that period before the primary, if you could find $590 million to give another tax break to wealthy businessmen, why can't you fix our roads? Why not reallocate that money, put it into our roads? And I know what the problem is downstate. They love to give tax breaks to the businessmen and the wealthy people, and the Republicans are very reluctant because they know the damage it will do to their reputation to tax people. They tax seniors, they increase the taxes on poor people and middle-class people, and they're very reluctant to do that. So my feeling is we have enough money in Lansing. It's just the fact that the legislature is misallocating it. They're spending it on things that they should not be spending it on. And our roads suffer, and our schools suffer, and our seniors suffer because of it.
So would you support any additional gas tax?
I would not support any gas tax. I know that most people, when they're polled, they say, yeah, we'd love to pay more taxes to fix our roads. Our roads are terrible and we understand it's going to cost money. But my feeling is, and my position is, we have enough money in Lansing. We don't need to raise taxes on middle class and poor people. We don't have to. And they're talking now about not increasing, but there was a Michigan Supreme Court ruling that said that there was in their big tax cut for the big business, they, quote, inadvertently included a provision that's going to cost the state another $1 billion. So-called out-of-state people don't have to pay our taxes. They're going to lose $1 billion. So they're talking about, well, let's change that provision of that law so we can get that $1 billion back from those people. My suggestion is, let's change the law and get back 1.8 plus the billion, $2.8 billion back into our treasury. We'd have plenty of money to fund our schools, fund our roads, get rid of the tax imposition on seniors' pensions. There's plenty of money.
To what extent, and we'll be jumping around topics, to what extent should the state be focusing on alternative energy development? Is there an act that the legislature can take to further that goal?
Absolutely, yes. And it's kind of a long story, perhaps. Years ago, I and a group of other people's native and non-native formed an organization called the Chippewa Commons Carbon Credit Cooperative. And we were trying to get into the California carbon credit market. But we found out that you can't do that as aggregated. You can't aggregate credits. We wanted to get small landowners and tribes to put their resources together and come up with a plan to raise money through the sequestration of carbon. And one of the things that we were going to do with that money that we raised was to build solar arrays at people's houses, put up windmills on Lake Superior shoreline or wherever it was feasible. And the creation of a sustainable forest management plan creates more jobs than any other dollar you can spend. So yeah, I'm very, very much in favor of all forms of energy. Come across the bridge there and you see 2 windmills on the south side. And where I'm from, up in Sault Ste. Marie, we don't really necessarily have a whole bunch in the Sioux, but on Sioux, Ontario, they have over 200 windmills on the shores of Lake Superior. And they also have huge, huge solar photovoltaic arrays, and they claim that they are the alternative energy capital of North America. So it can be done up here because they're all over outside today, it's all cloudy. But even on a cloudy day, you can generate electricity. And with the wind, you see the leaves blowing out there, it can easily be done. It's not, I hate to say it, but it's not rocket science. It's been proven that you can indeed create lots of alternative energy. Germany apparently is approximately 25% of all of its energy comes from renewables. And on some days, like last summer when it was nice and sunny, probably some good wind, they generated 100% of their energy needs through that process. So the state of Michigan could be at the forefront of this. We could create jobs like crazy, not only in the manufacture, but the installation and maintenance of all these things. So I'm very, very much in favor of alternative energies of any sort.
How do you spur it? The state's met its self-imposed mandate, and I don't know what is happening right now. What would you impose? Extending that, or?
Well, that's part of the problem I think that we have is that the utility companies are not necessarily the most enlightened group of people. They have their coal-fired plants or the gas-fired plants, and they want to maintain that monopoly on that energy. I can't go out and buy energy from somebody else. There's apparently a 10% cap on finding your own source, and that's been met, so you can't do that anymore. But if the state was to, and I know people don't like this idea, but impose the regulations that the Obama administration and the EPA have promulgated to reduce the carbon emissions, and force these companies to clean up their act. They might look at it and say, well, you know, it's going to cost us X amount of dollars to do this and do this and do this, but we could also just build some solar arrays and put up some windmills. Instead of putting our money into failed technology, put it into new advanced technology. And there are, I don't know if you've been downstate recently, but you go through, I think it's Gratiot County, there's huge windmill set up down there, hundreds of them. And they're building more and more. So the state should mandate a bigger percentage. I don't know exactly what it is. I think some people are saying 30% by 2030. But whatever it is, I think the state should impose those mandates and then make it easier for people to do that kind of thing instead of putting up these roadblocks.
Would you support offshore wind turbines?
Well, I know it's very controversial because people don't like the look of those windmills out there. But if a local community could get behind it, I think it's a fine idea. And also, I believe that there's a possibility of moving them so far offshore that you wouldn't see them necessarily. The lakes are huge. And there's also other technologies. You can use the current to generate electricity through turbines that are completely out of sight on the bottom of rivers and lakes and whatever. You can get wave action, all different kinds of things. You don't need to have necessarily these huge turbines up. Mackinac City has, right in their marina, I can't remember exactly how many, but they're 10 or 12, but they're relatively small. You know, they're not those big, huge, massive $1 million electricity things. So it can be done, and as long as the people, and yeah, this is probably not a real nice thing to say, but people would rather look at some cooling towers from a nuclear plant or look at some big smokestacks from a coal-fired plant. You know, personally, I'd rather see the windmills. So
What would you say to people who criticize windmills by saying they have major impacts on migratory birds and are dangerous to endangered birds especially?
Well, that is a problem, and a lot of it has to do with the siting. And I can't remember exactly where it is, but this was quite a long time ago. They put a big windmill array in the mountains of California, between California and Nevada, I guess. Mountain pass, lots of wind rushing through there. But guess what? It's the migratory bird path. I mean, you know, it wasn't well sited. In other words, they should have done a better job of siting it. Also, and I know a lot of cat lovers don't like to hear this, and I happen to be one, cats kill probably 100 times as many birds as the windmills did. So, and there are other things, and I'm not technically aware of exactly what they do, but you can do other things to keep the birds from getting into those windmills. And it is a problem, and I understand it is a problem, and it's a concern for everybody. But there are ways to get around that issue.
Let's talk about Detroit. If you had been in the legislature, would you have supported any form of a bailout for Detroit?
Yes, I would. I grew up in Livonia, which is just right next, the city right next to Detroit to the west. And when I was a young person, it was a vibrant, very, very prosperous city. I think there were close to 2 million people there, in the general area at least. And one thing that I think people don't understand very well is that during that period of time when there was very high prosperity and the auto industry was doing great, the state of Michigan was supported by the people of Detroit. And they were the ones who were the economic drivers of the whole system, the whole state. And obviously they fell on some bad times, and I'm not an expert in understanding exactly why, other than the fact that the auto industry's collapsed. But Detroit, if it succeeds, the state succeeds. If it fails, the whole state's going to fail. So yes, I'm in favor of that bailout process.
You mentioned briefly about funneling more money into education. Up here, there's a lot of concern about the disparity in per pupil funding levels. whether it be, it's not every school district, but a lot of the school districts here see fewer dollars per student than other districts in other portions of the state. How do we level that amount out among those school districts?
It's good you asked that question. Because it goes back to what I was just mentioning about the problem of funding. And I'll get to that part of it too. There's a website called kidsnotceos.com. And I just went through and I took all the data from these 8 counties in my district. And unfortunately, I don't have the total number of dollars, but this is just the last 4 years since the Snyder administration has been messing with our school system. We'll just pick one right here. How about Emmett County, Petoskey School District lost $3.455 million in 4 years. And that's above and beyond what you talked about, the shortfall in the funding because of the discrepancy in the districts. I've talked to some people who were on that commission way back when, and I forget exactly when it was, but proposal 1, we did this big property tax shift to the sales tax, and the whole idea was that we have to equalize our funding in the state. And I talked to these people, they sat on that commission, drew up that legislation, and they said, I asked them, I said, well, how come it didn't work? And it's because they refused to implement it. The program is in place. It's in the legislation. We have the laws that say you have to do this. They've just ignored it for the past, whatever it is, 30 years or something. So again, it's a problem. The state has the money, they misallocate it. People up here in the North Country, we don't have that many votes. So they could care less about us, quite frankly. And they have very densely populated school districts downstate, southeast Michigan, and Grand Rapids and whatever. And they have the loudest voice, so they get listened to. But I agree 100%. We need to get some way to get more money into our school system. I know a lot of people say, well, you're just throwing money at the problem. No, it's not. You cut the school funding, you end up with 60 students in a classroom or some stupid thing like that. And you can't run a functioning and efficient school system under those circumstances. You just can't do it. So I would love to see people in the legislature who would sit down and take another look at that bill and find out exactly where it was that Governor Engler decided that he didn't want to follow the law and redistribute the funds again.
Staying with education, should the state fully adopt and implement the Common Core standards for education?
Well, I know there's a lot of controversy on that issue, and I am in favor of having a Common Core. What I don't like is I don't like the idea that, okay, well, here's your Common Core, teacher. You don't have to follow it, but this is what's going to be on the test. So you end up teaching to the test, which I think is extremely detrimental to the educational process. And every teacher I've ever talked to, and I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of them, they absolutely despise the concept of teaching to the test. But I think we do need standards. And my understanding is, I haven't read all that legislation, but my understanding is that the standards are flexible. It's not like on day 1 you got to teach this chapter, on day 2 you teach this. It's not that kind of thing. So at the end of the year, students should achieve this particular level. And we have in this country, and certainly in this state, free, universal, and compulsory education. Everybody's got to go to school. We value this as a right. We implemented the school system because we believe that it's an important investment in our future. And I don't think that it's unfair to ask people to achieve a certain level at the end of that process. It costs a lot of money. And if we would I was a teacher. That's what I did for half my career at the university level. And we were fortunate that we were not given, actually I did teach a series of classes, and we were literally, you go in the room and they give you this syllabus and had your books listed and that was it. There was no independence in what you did in the classroom. You did this. But most classes I taught didn't have that. And it works out much, much better. You don't have that restriction on exactly what book you're going to use, for example, or what chapter you're going to teach on this particular day. And so it's flexible. So we need local control over the processes that take place in the classroom, but still I support the Common Core standards. I think they're important.
Going back to some environmental issues, is fracking properly regulated in Michigan?
If you listen to the DEQ, they would say yes. But from my own personal perspective, I say absolutely not. I've been involved in the call ourselves fractivists, anti-fracking movement since it started in the state of Michigan. What the biggest problem is, and they're finally getting around to understanding what this problem is, but the biggest problem is that they have been, quote, fracking wells for 60 years or whatever they say. But they've not been doing the deep hydraulic horizontal fracturing of wells. It's a very, very recent phenomenon, probably within the last 10 years or so. And they don't have the regulations to effectively and safely perform that process.
Yeah, I was just reading before we came in here that in the state Senate today, a bill was or will be introduced before the end of the day to amend the state's Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act to include protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. I don't know if this, should you win, I don't know if the issue will have been decided anyway, but is this something you'd support?
Yes, and I want to give a little caveat. And I've had this question before from other people, and I'm an American Indian, and quite frankly, I understand discrimination very well. I wish I didn't have to say that, but I do. My argument is, why do we even have a civil rights initiative, the Elliott Larson Act? Why don't we just follow our state constitution, which says all people are treated equally? Period. Why should we say, well, okay, this week it's okay to discriminate against her. After today, maybe we can say, no, we can't discriminate against her. It doesn't make any sense to me. We should just say, you can't discriminate against anybody for any reason whatsoever, period. That's my position on it. So
Are you advocating to get rid of the Elliott Larson Act?
No. I'm just saying the Elliott Larson Act should be amended to say the state of Michigan does not discriminate in all of its subdivisions and all the people who live here and all the businesses who live here do not discriminate against anybody for any reason whatsoever, period. Because, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but what if somebody says, oh, I don't like redheads. I can discriminate against redheads. It's not in the law. I can discriminate against them. You get into these subtle nuances where people say, well, it's not in the law. I can discriminate against you.
Earlier this year, the legislature increased the state's minimum wage from $7.40 to $9.25. Do you agree with that?
I agree with the raising of the minimum wage. I would have much preferred to see the ballot issue be presented to the voters to raise it to $10.15. If you look at the statistics, when the minimum wage was instituted, way back whenever that was, and the rate of inflation, for example, the minimum wage is not kept up. And if you look at it from the perspective of what has the productivity of the American workers been relative to what the minimum wage is now, it should be about $22 an hour, just to keep up with the productivity of the American workers. And that $10.15 is probably not too far off of where the inflation rate would have been. It might have been like $11 or maybe $12 if it was based on inflation. And I know that a lot of business people don't understand this. You'd think they should, but I don't know, they got blinders on or something. If I'm a minimum wage worker, and I'm getting $7 or whatever it is, and it's going to be bumped up, how am I going to come into your store and buy your goods from you if you keep my wages down? Every study has shown raising the minimum wage does not kill jobs. It's been a proven fact. If you look at the statistics, it does not eliminate jobs. It doesn't. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, it raises the job because there's more money to be had in the community. It's not like these people are going to take all that money and go and invest in the Cayman Islands or something. The right to work legislation, I think, is a disaster. And coupled with that is the big tax breaks for the wealthy people who don't need one. And which means that they had to cut our school funding, they had to tax our seniors, they had to get rid of much of the earned income tax credit and child support credits and homestead taxation. Some of that stuff is going up because income's being taxed, and it's a really hard formula. But the destruction of the middle class is going to be my #1 priority, restoring the middle class. And it might not make sense for some other people in other communities, but here in northern Michigan, we have lots of retired people, and what we don't have in retired people, we have tourism. And that demands a strong middle class. We can't do that up here without a strong middle class. So that's my #1 priority, and of course, the environmental stuff is exactly the same thing. Why do we live up here? Why do we live here? We live here because it's a clean and green environment. It's wonderful. We love it. If we have a problem with the pipeline or with fracking, etc., that stuff goes away. And we can't afford it, not only in a cultural sense, but in a literal monetary sense. We can't afford to cutting our middle class and destroying our environment. It's one of the things that they need, businesses need, is they need high-speed internet. And we need it everywhere, not just in this office, for example. We need to expand our infrastructure to support that kind of a robust information technology highway. And the same thing is true of our infrastructure generally, our bridges and our roads and our power lines and all that stuff. That's how we attract businesses up here. With the internet, if you had high-speed internet, you don't have to be downtown Detroit to run your business, CompuServe or whatever. They'd probably be really happy to come up to Petoskey or Traverse City. But the infrastructure's not here. So we need to fix that problem.